this is kind of the first bit is going to be kind of the broad introduction to Wikipedia, Wikipedia Is, all of them. It kind of, I suppose, centered a little bit around the experience of the English language Wikipedia, which does tend to obviously dominate everybody's mind when it comes to Wikipedia anyway, but maybe starting to signal some of the cultural or interface differences that you'll find between the different language Wikipedias. Then I'll switch over to actually live editing and showing you how the interface works, what the different language Wikipedias look like, the subtle differences that I've noticed so far between them. And then, as I said, I'll demonstrate how to edit Wikipedia, and then we can, if you want to, so I know that I've created accounts for you. If you want to start editing now, and anything that you're getting stuck with, anything that isn't clear, we can work through it today. But equally, if, as I was saying, Roshan and Fela, if the idea of editing right now, this minute, this morning feels a little bit more than you can cope with, we don't have to use the full 2 hours, and we can always you can use this as your primer, and then you can get properly stuck in a few weeks to, when we're in San Sebastian. Okay, so this is my general slide set that I use for all kind of introductions that I do. So with a few kind of minor tweaks towards the audience. But so I think everybody visited the link. That's it there again. If you want it. And when Galder and Aderney were talking about the dashboard earlier, this is the dashboard that we're talking about. So it's something that's used in a multitude of different ways. I could kind of do a very brief overview of what that looks like and why, I suppose, workshops, myself as a facilitator and Galder and Aderney would use it, and what the utility of it is. And the first is that if you have a facilitator like me who has specific rights on Wikipedia, I can create accounts for you. The benefit of that is if you were doing, there's a multitude of benefits to it. First of all, if you create an account on Wikipedia, which is now a global login, it logs you into all language Wikipedias, all Wikimedia projects, and I'll show you what that means later on. If you create an account yourself independently, on probation for a small amount of time. And depending on what project you're on, that can constrain you more or less. On minority language Wikipedias, it tends to constrain you less, because English language Wikipedia is probably one of the most locked down ones. So it'll stop you creating new articles, editing particular articles that are protected. It might show you captchas for the first amount of time. The way that I've created an account for you means that it leapfrogs you. Basically, I am giving you the seal of approval to say, I know who this human is. I'm creating an account for them, so it kind of brings you a few steps forward, basically, within that process. So you shouldn't be encountering captchas. You might do for your first edit or two, but a lot of that stuff just falls away. So it's kind of a check user type functionality. It also means that if you're on the ground, if you're in a physical location, if you try and create more than, I think it's about 10 new accounts on the same IP address, so in the same place, within 24 hours, that will be locked down. Stop vandalism. So it's to stop somebody creating hundreds or thousands of accounts all from their one computer and going and having mischief on Wikimedia projects. So when I'm in a physical location doing a workshop like this, I tend to create accounts for people because it works around that. There's other things that you can do around lifting restrictions on a particular IP, but that takes a little bit of kind of organization and knowledge beforehand. This kind of shortcuts all of that, basically. So it's kind of I suppose a technical, but also a practical. Okay, so if you want to take a wild guess as to how many times I've walked through these particular slides. So fundamentally, what is Wikipedia? And this, I think, helps when we're starting to communicate to others and to students what it is that starting to think about what does and does not belong on Wikipedia. Some of these kind of talking points can help with that conversation. So fundamentally, Wikipedia is an encyclopedia, but it is a free web-based collaborative and multilingual one. So it doesn't worry about, there's no paywalls, there's never going to be any paywalls. It's not worried about having a physical version, so it's not constrained by space. So it can be as big or as small as the community decides it to be. It's collaborative, So, as we said here, written collaboratively, every one article that you look at won't have just one author. And we can think of that in kind of a sense of scale. So your high profile, high traffic articles, particularly on English language Wikipedia, you know, your likes of Boris Johnson or Donald Trump or whatever, are going to have hundreds of thousands of people have probably edited or made contributions to those articles. And then once you kind of go down the long tail, once you get into more niche content, you might have one or two editors editing a particular article, but everything is this kind of collaborative form. And as I said, it's multilingual, which is no surprise to anybody here. It's editable by everyone. Now, I always put the caveat that everyone with the technology and a stable internet or a suitable internet connection, which is not everybody in the world, which is why Wikimedia projects have massive content gaps. Because while the edit button is available to everybody, not everybody has the I suppose the privileges to be able to actually use that meaningfully. So this sort of project and other ones that are being done all around the world are trying to address some of those content gaps in a systematic way. You've probably gotten some conception of how the wider Wikimedia verse works. So groups like our one here in Ireland, Wikimedia Community Ireland, within the Basque Wikimedians user group as well, we are what's referred to as a recognised affiliate. So we have gone through a process where we have the stamp of approval from the Wikimedia Foundation to say that we can represent them within our, in this case, geographical context, but it also can be regional, language, and content. It could be thematic. So there is user groups looking at, say, there's a user group for librarians, there's one for art and feminism, which again is about the gender gap. But basically the foundation has said, we recognise this particular group, and in our case, we get funding from the Wikimedia Foundation for that. And the Wikimedia Foundation is the charity based in San Francisco in the United States that, in a very basic way, when you are asked for your $5, you know, your price of a cup of coffee, to donate to Wikipedia when you visit it during particular times of the year, that's where the money goes. It initially goes, you know, on basic costs like keeping the servers up, employing staff to make sure that Wikipedia stays going, but also, you know, ancillary staff, and then this kind of pool of funds that then gets disseminated across the world. Okay. Fundamentally, how Wikipedia works is that it's obviously kind of familiar with the anybody can edit ethos. But fundamentally, and it's a bit of a mouthful, it is an aggregator of open license resources. But what do we mean by that? It means that sometimes you will encounter on language Wikipedias that public domain text has been imported in. So say if there's an encyclopedia, an Irish language or a Frisian encyclopedia, a printed one that existed has now fallen out of copyright. So it's over, say, 70 or 100 years old. And that text has been OCR'd, it's been, you know, digitized and typeset. What you will find sometimes is that will just be imported in whole into Wikipedia. And that's because it can ingest suitably licensed content. In the Irish language context, there was an encyclopedia written, I think about a decade ago, that was put under a Creative Commons license, so a suitable interoperable license, which meant that all the content of that encyclopedia was immediately imported into Wikipedia. So it'll take, and so there's that kind of, I suppose, mass element to it, but it also means, and there's also, from an individual user point of view, there's a philosophical and a pragmatic element to this as well. Philosophical thing is that Wikipedians like open license stuff. So when we are researching a topic, when we are looking for something to write about, we are going to go to similarly open license content first. So stuff that isn't behind a paywall, that doesn't require, you know, going to a specific library, that doesn't, you know, have that kind of extra layer of access needed first. And that's kind of a philosophical thing. We like open license stuff. Then there's a practical element. It's easier to get your hands on open license stuff. So when you are researching something, if something is freely available on the web and you can cite it easily, you're going to go for the low-hanging fruit. So there's kind of two elements to that as well. Everything that you see on Wikipedia is what we refer to as peer-reviewed. There's a few different ways of kind of looking at that, but fundamentally it means that when I write a brand new article and publish it, immediately other people see that that article has appeared or kind of floats into people's view, and they will start doing things like doing little tweaks, fixing my grammar, usually my spelling, adding links to other Wikipedia articles, adding content to it, removing content that they think is unsuitable. And that's what we mean by peer reviewed. There is also a method of peer reviewing articles by and giving them a ranking regards quality, but that's kind of an extra level of complexity that we can deal with later. Every version, every time you press publish on a Wikipedia article, your new version is saved, but every single other version is also saved. Okay, so every time somebody else has pressed the publish button, you can go back, and I'll show you how to access this. You can see the history of the article, so you can see every single difference that has been made to an article. This has two functions. One, you can see the evolution of an article. You can see what each individual editor has done. But secondly, if somebody vandalizes an article or does something that in some way damages the article, you can very quickly revert. So you can restore the previous version of the article, and nothing is lost in that process, basically. There are some cases where the history of an article might be hidden, and that's usually if there's a massive copyright violation or if somebody gets libeled, and they will be hidden from the public record. They're not deleted, they're just not accessible unless you're an administrator. Everything on Wikipedia is published under this Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike license. Are people aware of Creative Commons licenses, or is that a... So it's basically a Creative Commons license is a way of, it's still a form of copyright. So you as a creator, if you take a photograph tomorrow, you could upload it to Flickr or Wikimedia Commons, and you explicitly add a Creative Commons license to it. So you're saying, as the author, I am stating to everybody else who accesses this image or this, piece of text or whatever it is, that I am allowing reuse of this in particular contexts. So there's all sorts of different versions, so the most restrictive is obviously all rights reserved, and then you go all the way up in permissiveness to public domain. So public domain is something that's out of copyright, but you can also, so like the US government, the NASA, all that's automatically public domain. So all photographs taken by NASA. All right, so you can publish into the public domain. It doesn't have to wait the 70 to 100 years to lapse out of it. And Creative Commons is kind of in that spectrum. So what this means fundamentally is that we can go to Wikipedia, we can download 10, 20 articles, we could put them into a book and we could publish it and we could sell it. But what we would have to do is we would have to attribute. So we have to say that we got it from Wikipedia on this particular date, these particular articles perhaps pointing to the URLs. And we couldn't put a restrictive copyright on it. We couldn't say that now all rights are reserved on this. It has to be share alike. So it has to be the same license again. So we would have to put, so CC by SA is the acronym for it. So that's Creative Commons by attribution, share alike, SA. So that's most content that you will come across on Wikipedia. And when it comes to images, it has to be this license, so share alike or public domain, so more permissive. There are versions of this where, as a creator, you can say no derivatives. So you can use my image, but you can't edit it in any way. You can't change it. And you can also say non-commercial. So you can say you can use this image, this recording, this piece of text, but you can't make money from it. Those caveats, they aren't allowed on Wikimedia projects. Okay, so if you come across those licenses, a lot of GLAMs in particular love putting the non-commercial caveat on their content, which means you can't use them. So even if it's, and they love slapping those licenses on public domain work as well, which is a whole other problem unto itself. And I could do a whole hour lecture on that alone. So this is the I suppose the mission statement of Wikipedia as set out by Jimmy Wales, who's now kind of the figurehead of Wikipedia. He doesn't sit on the board of Wikimedia Foundation or anything like that, but he's still, I suppose, the spiritual leader of the movement. And it's this idea that everybody has free access to the sum of all human knowledge. Now, in the 21 years since Wikipedia was first published, we're kind of thinking about what that actually means. So those issues around the content gaps, who actually can meaningfully edit Wikipedia, but also issues around this kind of highly textual and the idea of citations the way that we understand it in, kind of Europe and North America and Australia, as opposed to other parts of the world that might be more oral, more visual, less textual. So, you know, we're kind of, as a movement, we're doing a lot of navel gazing and a lot of thinking about how we actually open this up to a wider conversation and kind of make it less US European centric in its viewpoint. As I said, feel free to stop me or ask me questions at any point if anything isn't clear, or if I'm boring the socks off you as well. Do let me know that. So when we talk about this, I mean, you have some idea of what this is what I refer to as the difference between the M and the P, between Wikipedia and Wikimedia. So you can see that this is kind of a whole constant. I don't know if you can actually see my cursor, but it's like a whole constellation of Wikimedia projects. And you can see that Wikipedia is one of them. So it's the globe there. But we have a whole host of other projects. The one here kind of going counterclockwise, the arrow, that's for commons. So that's where, as I said, so Wikimedia Commons is where all the images, sound files, video files, all that sort of stuff lives. But we also have things like Wikisource, which is about transcribing open licensed books of their other publications. So those kind of those out of copyright encyclopedias would often find their way onto Wikisource and get transcribed. Then we have Wikinews, Wiktionary, Wikiversity, Wikivoyage, Wikidata, Incubator, MediaWiki, Wikispecies, Wikiquote, MetaWiki, Wikibooks, and Wikimania. And say that really fast, Trunk. So these are all the various different projects. I mean, Wikimania is it's kind of here as a project, but it's a big international conference that we do once a year. So it's kind of it's become hybrid, as all these things have. But so this is the difference between somebody referring to themselves as a Wikipedian. So I suppose anchored in one project, they edit their Wikipedia, whatever language that is, or somebody like myself who would probably refer to themselves as a Wikimedian, who is involved in a number of different projects, might edit Wikipedia, but then upload some pictures, but then edit Wikidata a little bit, you know, maybe add some etymology to a Wiktionary, that sort of thing. So there's kind of there's a difference between how people view themselves. And particularly with English language, you will find people, but even German or some of the other larger languages, people just see themselves as a Wikipedian. That's what they do, and they don't really interact necessarily, or in some cases view the other projects as particularly, you know, kind of useful or as important as their Wikipedia. That's the important bit. This is my kind of why bother slide. So of all the things you're going to do with yourself, why would you edit Wikipedia? Why would you bother? And I suppose that it's the impact piece. It's you know, the fact that everybody goes to it. So it is, and this again is talking about English language Wikipedia, but even for some of the other larger languages, they are now the largest encyclopedias ever written. So actually, Wikipedia, I think, overtook the nearest largest written encyclopedia somewhere around 2009. So it's been the largest the largest encyclopedia for a very long time now. So that's both in breadth, so the amount of articles that we have, but also in depth, so how long a number of those articles are. And it makes sense if you think about physical encyclopedias were constrained by space. You couldn't have an infinite printed encyclopedia because nobody would ever be able to afford it. You know, so we don't have that constraint, basically. So I checked this last night. There's 327 language Wikipedias. So English being the oldest and the largest, and then kind of going down to some of the smallest are things like the Cree language. So very, very small minority languages, you know, might be spoken and written by, we're probably talking about thousands of people as opposed to hundreds of thousands of people. Wikipedia projects generally are accessed about 500 million times each month, and that's spread across the various different languages. And we have, you know, 21 billion page views, and probably the 3 billion is probably that's probably a very kind of conservative estimate. It's probably much higher than that. There are ways in which data is accessed in certain parts of the world which kind of will bundle together kind of unique visits. So it's probably much, much higher on mobile devices. And that's probably growing as well. So everybody writes, anybody who can write Wikipedia. So who writes it? Us. Anybody who's motivated to press that edit button is an editor of Wikipedia or contributor to Wikipedia. As I said, with the massive caveats of who's actually able to do it and who feels empowered to do it. We have about 130,000 regular contributors. So regular contributor to Wikipedia is somebody who makes at least 5 edits, 1 to 5 edits in a calendar month. This metric appears in the early years of Wikipedia out of nowhere, and I could never find, I have not been able to find out who came up with it and why. The metric was pulled out of somebody at some point in the early years of the project to decide that this is what we mean by a regular contributor. So you're making you're pressing that publish button at least 5 times, within any kind of 30 days. There are, when you go to sign up to Wikipedia, there's something like, I think there's over 400,000 registered contributors. It could be more. So a lot of people will create an account and then never make any, or might make 1 or 2 edits and then go away. So they're obviously not a regular contributor. I suppose a very active contributor is somebody who makes more than 5 edits, and that could be anything from somebody making 6 edits in a month to making 1,000. There are some kind of hyperactive editors within the community. We'll take a look at that list in a while because it's interesting to look at. So English has over 6 million articles, but there is, and I'll share, actually this slide deck is in the Google Drive under the meetings, so you can take a look at it there. So any of the hyperlinks you can follow through yourself. It's shared already. This is my favorite quote about Wikipedia. If Wikipedia didn't exist and we sat down in a room today to decide to found it, the idea that you would take an encyclopedia that was entirely crowd-written, people from all around the world, the idea that you would get them to agree on style, language, what would be included, who would decide that it would be published. It sounds like herding cats on the internet. Like, it sounds ridiculous. You would get laughed out of any room. But for some reason, so in theory, it sounds stupid. It sounds silly. But for Wikipedia, it works in practice. And lots of people have spent an awful lot of time trying to study why exactly the magic sauce of Wikipedia works when a lot of other ones failed. There's a few competing theories, but it seems to be kind of an accident of time, place, people. Just seems to have been the reason that it came together. And that quote has been attributed to everybody and nobody, including Jimmy Wales, and he denies it. When we're thinking about who are these people who edit Wikipedia, so this is the last Wikimania that I attended in 2015, which feels like a very long time ago now. Again, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I am there. I'm near the top of my head. So this is in Mexico. This was in a very swanky, you can see behind us, I think that's a Rodin, a copy of a Rodin behind us. There was a lot of Salvador Dali and other things in this. And a few minutes after this photograph was taken, we were a Mexican Beatles tribute band played up. So this is one of our kind of our partner meetings, as it were. And you can see Jimmy Wales there is in the front. But what you'll notice from this picture is that you'll notice it's probably 50-50, or represents a good gender divide and representation. You're also seeing people from all over the world. So it's not predominantly, it's probably still swinging towards mostly white people, but it's trying to be more representative. So these are the people who, like myself, advocate for Wikipedia, work for affiliates around the world, or do voluntary work in their own context, in their own language, in their own region, that sort of thing. And this, looks quite diverse. And of course, this is across languages as well. But when you drill down, specifically if you look at English language Wikipedia, but as we've talked about a little bit when we talk about the gender gap, this gets mirrored across all language Wikipedias. There is a stark gender divide. Now, this research here you're going to notice is quite old. It's 2009. This has been repeated in probably about 10 years out from it. And these are what we were referring to as our regular contributors. So the people who are making at least 5 edits in a month. They are predominantly men. They are between the ages of 18 and 30. They have at least an undergraduate degree. They have no partner and they have no children. So what do they have? Lots of time. lots of time and probably strong opinions about what's important. And what we've discovered when this research has been replicated in the time since is that still the core of editors is predominantly these people. They're just 10 years older. So they're still around. An awful lot of them are still around. And some of them will have changed their tune as regards what they think is important, but others are still kind of thinking about Wikipedia in the same way that we were thinking about it in 2009. So what this means is you will get an article, particularly on English language Wikipedia, about every battle that's been fought, every train that's been commissioned, every gun that's ever been created. But you won't necessarily get articles about women artists, people of colour, topics that in general and in broad strokes, talking in very broad strokes, these people do not find interesting, or may sometimes debate whether or not it is notable or important enough to be included on Wikipedia. So they might actually push back. They will have their own biases about deciding on whether or not something is important enough to be included. So this is the legacy content gap that we're dealing with. And as I said, some of these editors have become allies, so they're quite active in projects like Women in Red and trying to address these gaps, but some of them are still kind of thinking along the same lines that they always have. On that, does anybody have any questions? I'll take a brief sip of tea, so you're not just listening to my monotone voice for God knows how long. Does that all make sense so far?
Yeah, Rebecca, you were talking about what why Wikipedia is a success, despite it shouldn't be. What are your own thoughts about that? Why does it work?
I think it is the one that it gets compared to the most is what's referred to as H2G2, which is the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Around the same time, there was an attempt to crowdsource basically a full form of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And that was quite successful, and a lot of editors actually moved from, they started on H2G2 and eventually found their way onto Wikipedia. And some content was actually, because it was under a suitable license, was migrated over. I think it eventually got mothballed. But that was a very specific project in that it had to be written as if it was, so Earth is, as if you were an alien visiting Earth content. And I think that was just a little bit too niche. Some people have thought that it's the ability to edit anonymously. An awful lot of these projects made you register and made you verify your identity. So the encyclopedia that predated this, so Jimmy Wales and Larry Sanger came up with the idea of Newpedia. Well, Jimmy Wales came up with it. And Newpedia mirrored the traditional encyclopedia in that you had to be a subject specialist to write about a particular, so you had to verify your credentials. You had to have a degree or a master's or a doctorate. And then there was an actual, like a journal, a peer review process. And what they found was that it was just a massive bottleneck. They couldn't get anything published because of all these layers of bureaucracy. So kind of in response to that, Larry Sanger, who's now one of the most vocal opponents of Wikipedia, he tested it out in the wiki software and just opened it up and sent it around to a few of his friends and said, could you play around with this? And it took off because the barrier for entry was just so much lower. And it meant that you could create an article. It was like, tarmac is a substance that's used to create roads. And that's all you needed, to create a new article. You didn't have to have these kind of layers. And that continuing ability to edit anonymously, while it comes with an awful lot of downsides and the need to patrol an awful lot of that activity, particular researchers have seen that as one of the persistent, because the most edits that happen, and I'll tell you a little, if the idea of anonymous editing sounds a bit kind of strange, I'll show you what that looks like. But the majority of edits that happen on Wikipedia are not by registered users. They are by these anonymous editors. And a lot of them are quite small edits, they're putting in an apostrophe, taking it out, that sort of thing. But yeah, it's that just very low barrier for entry. And that's why with English language Wikipedia, it peaked around 2009. That was kind of the highest point of it. And it's been, as regards kind of contributors and people signing up, it's been going down ever since, and it's kind of stabilized. And there was a huge amount of panic about that we're contracting, we're getting smaller. But what you'll actually notice is that, I suppose, all of the low-hanging fruit of English language Wikipedia was gone. So that huge growth spurt that we saw had to slow down eventually because all of the really obvious stuff had already been written about, or it started to be written about. So the ability for somebody to come in and just write a very simple article started to get more niche as time went on. And people finding that niche gets a little bit harder as time goes on as well. So other language Wikipedias still have that ability to have that steep increase if that's what they think is important for their language. Again, it's the breadth versus the depth argument.
Yeah.
Do you go for lots and lots of small, short articles, or do you go for a smaller amount of articles that are actually quite detailed?
Yeah. I was thinking maybe another reason that it works, that although it is a very wide international group, they are working in smaller groups, and those groups are probably quite homogeneous in a way.
They can be.
Yeah. So then there is a little less chance of having less conflicts in that respect. So I was wondering if you think that if other people who are outside of those parameters that you just showed are more involved in Wikipedia, would there be probably more conflict, and would it maybe work not as good as it has been in respect of creating content?
It's an interesting one. So some scholars have said that because we talk about consensus on Wikipedia. So say if there's a dispute between, it could be between two editors, or it could be between two groups of editors as to, so there's lots of classic ones for which there is no right answer. Is it Derry or Londonderry? You know, liminal spaces on Wikipedia. Another one was whether or not Kiev should be spelled in the traditional kind of Anglophone way, or should it be in the Ukrainian language. Denance was another one, like whether we should use the German or should, and depending on the language Wikipedia you're on, there's different takes on that. So we had this idea that you have consensus. So you open an AFC, which is for comment, asking for comment, and people will lay out their arguments as to why it should be the way that they think it is. And that can turn into a wall of text very quickly. So what you'll find is there's certain kind of, I suppose, personality and sometimes quite gendered traits that some people are drawn towards that sort of conversation, and other people are immediately turned off and they will walk away. So there's what I refer to quite often on Wikipedia as the silent majority. There's a lot of people that just don't engage in that stuff. They just see somebody slap an AFC up and they go, you know what, I'm out. They immediately tap out. They don't get. So sometimes the community that actually decides on things can be quite kind of a small subset. There's a particular Polish researcher that, when we talk about consensus, he actually says that it's actually dissent, that, we argue with each other an awful lot. Easy truce sometimes. The idea of calling it all consensus is probably misleading because it makes it sound all kind of warm and fuzzy and everybody's happy at the end of it, whereas it's probably slightly more like the EU, where everybody is unhappy, but they're unhappy to a level that they can live with, particularly on English. Now, on smaller language Wikipedias, when the community is smaller, they can be more dynamic, and perhaps, it's a smaller pool of, which obviously has positive and negatives, because you have a smaller pool of people deciding on things that then impact a whole language project. So you get there's kind of cultural elements to it, and there's kind of personal elements to it as to whether or not you feel strong. I always think there's that XKCD comic, which is, somebody's on a computer and they're like, darling, come to bed. And he's like, I can't. Why? Somebody is wrong on the internet. There's a lot of those Wikipedians as well, and they're the ones that get, weighed into those conversations. Whereas for me, I'm like, I might add a comment sometimes, but most of the time I've got better things to do with my life. And especially if you are, a woman who has caring responsibilities, who has other things to be getting on with, you're not going to spend 3 hours hashing these things out with people because you literally have better things to be doing. So it's trying also, there's kind of a cultural shift, or an attempt to talk about a cultural shift as to how these things play out on Wikipedia and how to make those spaces friendlier. And it's kind of a hangover from that era of the web, you know, that 2001 text-heavy web, which is completely alien in comparison. You know, if you were born in 2000, the idea that people conduct themselves purely through text in this way on the web is just, it's ridiculous in a lot of ways. So we're probably going to have to change how we do things because we're going to have a generational shift as well. Yeah, it's fascinating. This is why I wrote a doctorate, partially about it. So if I get boringly academic about it, do stop me, because I have, yeah. Does anybody else have any questions? All good so far? Yeah, excellent, excellent. So when we're thinking about actually starting to edit Wikipedia, and I've gone on in this section too long now, and I apologize. This probably might be slightly more broadcast than practical at this point, but I'll try and get through this quickly. So there are so when we talk about kind of consensus and how the community decides things, there are only 5 unchangeable, unmutable facts about Wikipedia. So these are the 5 things that Wikipedia will always be, and they're referred to as the pillars. It's an encyclopedia. It doesn't try to be anything else. It's not a news site. It's not a social network. It's not a blog. It's none of these things. It's written from the neutral point of view. And we can discuss this a little bit further later on, but it's the idea of, it's an encyclopedic tone. So when you're reading an encyclopedia, you know, it's not like an essay. It's not trying to win you over to a particular point of view. It's just presenting facts. And you know, you can argue the philosophical ideas of objectivity and neutrality, but we just represent the facts as found in the source material without any undue bias, basically. It's free. So it's never going to disappear behind a paywall. This was very important in the first few years of Wikipedia when it wasn't a charity yet, and you know, kind of how it could exist into the future still had question marks over it, but that it's always free and it's always going to be editable and distributable. So it's always going to be under those open licenses. And there's never going to be a point where we say, this article is finished, so we're going to take away the edit button. The edit button is always going to be there. Wikipedians should interact in a respectful and civil manner, as you can imagine, on the internet. Talking to each other purely in text, things can get fraught, feelings can get hurt. So we try, it's also referred to as assume good faith. So just remember that, you know, whatever username or IP address you're looking at, it is a human behind it, and we try and be nice to each other, basically. And the 5th rule is that these are the 5 rules of Wikipedia, and they're the 5 principles. Everything outside of that is up for debate. So as regards some of the things that have changed, over the last few years is how we deal with pronouns, for example. That was something that wasn't, you know, important or wasn't mainstream in 2001, or didn't seem important to people editing Wikipedia, but now is very important how we deal with, you know, the likes of Elliot Page. How does their article change over time? So those sorts of what we refer to as style guides and manuals of style and policies, somebody can propose that something changes, and if enough of the community agree, then that change will be adopted. So these are the only things that can't change in that manner, basically. So we've kind of discussed a bit this already. So with the neutral point of view, it's, you're not writing an essay in kind of that traditional sense where you're putting forward your own thesis and then you have the supporting material and you have your own conclusions. With encyclopedic writing, you're finding the information as reported in reputable sources, and you're not putting any of your own personal bias or opinion into it. We use verifiable sources, and we'll go into a little bit more of that, but you know, when we're talking about academic writing, it's the type of sources that you'd be familiar with. And there's no original research on Wikipedia, which just means, and again, if we think back to the old-fashioned encyclopedia, you never read something for the first time in an encyclopedia. It wasn't a publisher of original thought. It would condense kind of established knowledge into the encyclopedia, and you would read it there. So similarly with Wikipedia, it's not going to publish something for the first time. You know, it's always going to cite a published source. And this kind of, you know, this becomes difficult, as you'd imagine, with kind of underrepresented content. What we decide is a verifiable source is very kind of Anglo-US, European-centric. We assume good faith, so we try and be nice to each other. Sometimes people make this harder or easier. And we avoid conflict of interest. So this may or may not come up for some of you. You know, you don't edit, if you have an article about yourself, you don't edit it. But similarly, if you're related to somebody famous, or say the institution that you work for, if you have some sort of personal relations, especially where it could be seen that you would gain from. So an example is my PhD supervisor has a Wikipedia article on English. I've never edited it because, you know, we have a type of professional relationship where if he looks good, I also could look good. So I, you know, really with conflict of interest, I shouldn't edit that. Now, if you work for an institution and you want to edit articles that are relevant to it, you can state your conflict of interest. The main issue with COI, as it's called, is if you try and hide it. So if you try and be nefarious, basically, but you can state it, and it just means that your edits might just get a little bit more scrutiny in relation to that topic. But generally, you try and avoid it as best you can. You've already created your user accounts, but again, you can consult this slide again. When we're dealing with students, these are kind of good things to know. You don't share an account with anybody. You can edit anonymously, and I'll show you what that looks like. Now, we call it anonymous editing, but what actually happens is your IP address is logged. So anybody can visit the history of an article, look at that IP address, and broadly geolocate it. So it'll say something like, you know, Dublin, Ireland. It won't give a street address or anything like that. But it does mean that it's not pure anonymity in that sense. With your user account, it can be your real name or a pseudonym. And with students, you might encourage them to maybe, I know in the Basque Country, they have particular conventions. On English language Wikipedia, if you create a bunch of accounts that are all like, you know, Closh Oriel student 1, you know, it's through to 30, they might all get blocked quite quickly. Because it just kind of sends up a few red flags of these might be disposable accounts that just people get a little bit bristly about. Probably not the case on Irish language Wikipedia itself, though, especially if the community are aware of the project that's going on. I'm going to cough very briefly, so I'm going to mute myself. You don't have to listen to that. As I mentioned earlier, once you create an account and start making edits, you kind of come out of a probationary period. So you've already kind of leapfrogged a little bit of that. But it means that articles that are locked, that are protected, once you have, say, 10 or 20 published edits, then you could start editing those articles. It's just that you become a trusted user over time. It's a bit like getting your blue tick on Twitter or whatever. And the reason that you create an account, I mean, some people they're anonymous editors and they will be anonymous editors for forever. They never want to create an account. But the reason that you do is that you build up, much like you do with your tweets or being on Reddit or whatever platform that you're on, you build up, I suppose, a history of all the edits that you've done, and people get to know what you're about. Basically, you develop a presence on the platform. And that might mean very simply that people are kind of interested in what you're doing. They might, you know, talk to you on your talk page about it, but also that you might start to be seen as kind of a subject specialist. You know, if you're only ever editing articles on Irish castles, and then there's somebody's having a discussion over here as to whether or not this is a castle or a tower house or a manor house or a big house or whatever we should call it, they might tag you into the conversation and say, hey, you seem to know a lot about this. Do you want to comment on this conversation? So that's, you know, it's that kind of, I suppose, kind of social behavior, or people noticing what it is that you're particularly interested in, your specialist subject that way. This is the general interface for creating an account. Again, you kind of leapfrog this, and you can see that. So from, I suppose, a GDPR or a data perspective, Wikipedia only ever asks you for a username and a password. And as you can see, your email address is optional. Now, in the system that you used, you did need to supply an email address because there was kind of a default password sent to you, but you don't actually have to link an email address to it. It is good because it means that if somebody posts a message on your talk page or wants to get in contact with you, you get an email about that. If you don't obviously add your email address, that doesn't happen. It also means that if you forget your password, it's easier to recover it if you have an email address associated with it. And you can add or update the email address associated with it in your settings. And you can see here that you have your CAPTCHA, which should disappear quite quickly. Again, these slides are going to be available for you to look at later on, but when we're talking about kind of our suitable or our verifiable referencing, we're talking about our usual go-to information sources. We're talking about published books, mainstream press publications, so not tabloids, but kind of your papers of record, that sort of thing, and reputable journals. Now, students at the level that we're talking at probably aren't going to be interacting necessarily with journals as much as, say, university students would. And they probably won't have access to the type of institutional repositories that perhaps university students would. But there is a possibility that through some of the GLAMs that we're working with, there might be some kind of interaction with journals, be it a local history one or, you know, History Ireland or something like that. So they probably don't need to think about ideas of predatory journals, but we might introduce that to kind of, you know, as regards the, I suppose, the critical digital skills, like just because something looks like it's a reputable source online doesn't always necessarily mean that it is. So I suppose we can cross that bridge when we come to it if the students start to encounter that sort of kind of pay to publish type content. But usually if they're coming across something through their own library, that sort of thing, they don't have to worry about that element of it. The reason we use these sources is because they're verifiable. Somebody else can follow in your informational footsteps and double check the information that you're reporting from it, that it is true. Sometimes if you get a particularly nefarious editor, they might add some content to Wikipedia and throw in a citation to make it look like they're taking it from a particular source, you know, to try and kind of circumvent. But somebody will invariably double check their work and remove anything kind of dubious there. Jeremy, in my experience, that happens an awful lot in politicians' Wikipedia pages. And we're looking at secondary sources. So obviously primary sources are your original research, you know, interview transcripts, some archival material. What we're particularly interested in is secondary sources. So what we're talking about here is books, journals, news articles, but also it could also be kind of state television, RT, documentaries. It could be radio shows, but we're kind of talking about, I suppose, local radio will be viewed in one way, and then say a state broadcaster will be viewed in another way. So we probably put more weight on a state broadcaster than we would on a local or an indie type show. What's broadly unsuitable, you can see the list there. Some of these things have changed a little bit over time, particularly blogs. You know, like the National Library of Ireland, the Victoria and Albert Museum, they have blogs. So those, you know, they would go through a publication process. So they would be viewed in a slightly different way than, say, the random blog that you find on the internet, which would generally not be a suitable reference. But it's, and you never cite another Wikipedia article. So we're ensuring that the information that we're bringing into Wikipedia is of a sufficient standard and quality. Okay. So any questions or anything? No? Great stuff. This is, and I think
sorry,
when
Rebecca, will you see your recording? Are you going to put that online for us to watch back, or?
I think Anastasia is.
Slides, yeah, okay. All right, yeah, perfect. That's all right. Just so we can use it. Lovely.
I also have they're not great quality. I have a set of 12 YouTube videos that I did very early on in the pandemic that I can send you the link to as well. I didn't have the fancy microphone at that point, so the sound is not quite as good. But this is the idea of notability, and this is who gets included on Wikipedia. Okay, or what gets included on Wikipedia. And when we're talking about that kind of list that we're, that initial list that we developed, we might have to do a little bit kind of checks and balances on to make sure that we're not setting up any of the students for failure, basically. So somebody might be very important, but it might be very difficult to find secondary sources on them. So the students are kind of hitting a bit of a wall with it. So there'll be a little bit of kind of parsing of the list that we'll have to do. But with notability, we're looking for significant coverage. So the person, the place, the thing is written about an awful lot, and by, numerous people. In reliable sources, so in books, mainstream press, and reputable journals. You have sources, you have multiple, so you're not just drawing on one source. Independence of the subject, depending on what you're writing about, comes in more or less. But say the woman that we're writing about, worked for a particular institution or a particular university, and all the sources that you can ever find are all coming from that organization or university. What you would like is something independent of that. So of course they're going to think that that person is really important. But what you really want is, like a newspaper or a journal or somebody independent, somebody without that affiliation saying, actually, no, this person is really important and we should write about them. So that's what we mean by independence. And if you reach those 4 barriers, it is presumed that that subject is notable enough. Okay. Somebody might still argue it with you. It's not black and white. It's not a yes, no. there's kind of a gradient to it. Some of the red flags to look out for is if you're writing about a topic and there's only ever one person publishing on it. So it's the same historian, it's the same academic, you know, they're the only person writing about something. That's a bit of a red flag. If nobody else has ever studied that area or written about that person, it probably means that they might not have hit the level of notability yet. And we can, as I said, as we work through our list of candidates for articles, this is also, notability can be far more difficult on English language Wikipedia. The standard can seem much, much higher. On smaller language Wikipedias, the community can be freer with notability. So for example, on Welsh Wikipedia, they're like, if you've published a book, written a poem, been on TV, have a radio show, you in Welsh, you are notable enough to be on the Welsh language Wikipedia. But that person might not be notable enough for English language. But if you can be notable within your language, basically. So we're not, I suppose we don't probably have to be quite as worried. It would be kind of an apprehension that I would have rather than being rigorous. You know, so we can, if somebody is notable in Frisian, more than likely the language group is going to agree with you, you know, especially if you have some sources to back it up. Would you say that Wikipedia has no rules? But it's often said that if we did have a rule, this would be it. And of course, for Irish people, this reads a very different way. Because in Hiberno or Irish English, being bold can also be being naughty. But this is in the American sense of the word to be brave, basically. So as I have done, I've talked for almost an hour about Wikipedia in an abstract way. But actually, the easiest way to learn how Wikipedia works is actually to do it in practice. Okay, and you can't break it. People try all the time and fail. And everything, as I said before, anything you do can be undone. So even if you press publish and go, nah, I didn't mean to do that, it can be very quickly undone. So that nothing is breakable. I won't go through all of this stuff right now. As I said, these slides are available to you within the partner meetings, in the virtual meetings folder. It's just if you're interested in particularly in translation. These are just some, I prepared these for a translation group that I worked with this year. You might be interested in looking at the translation platform just for your own personal interest. But do you have any questions before we get stuck in? No? All good? Okay. So I think you've all encountered, this is where you requested your accounts from me. So this is what Galder was referring to as the education or the outreach dashboard. So if I log in, and it'll ask me to log in through Wikipedia. So once you return to this, it uses your Wikimedia credentials to log you into the platform, basically. So I'm already enrolled, which is why it's telling me that enrollment user may not join twice. So what this means, so we have our 9 editors. So all of the accounts that I've created for people, you're all now enrolled in this course. So this can be used for, I'll make that a bit bigger actually, sorry. So this can be used for what we both call kind of editathons, events, one-off events that say we do with a cultural partner, or a longer term. So when I work with university students or groups of students where they might be working over 3 months, the time constraints at the moment, you can see I've set it just to 1 day. So it runs from midnight to midnight. And it's grabbed, obviously Irish Standard Time. But you can set that for months at a time. That could be 6 months. And it'll grab, so anybody who's enrolled in the course, any edits that they do will be logged by this tool. So you can see that once we have activity, it's not absolute real time, but it grabs the information quite quickly. It'll show you what edits are being made, by whom, and where. So from the point of view, I suppose, of invigilation or seeing what your students are up to, this will give you a log of what they're at. Is
that pre-published then? Pre-published edits, you know, the
yeah,
way,
it's all edits. So I'll show you what it actually, so this is a course, this is the course that I worked on. They were -7. That's weird. So this is they were translation students. So again, you can see, so you can set what Wikipedias are tracked. So you can see we've tracked English, That's Mandarin Chinese, Portuguese, Italian, German, French. I think that's Hindi, and Irish. So if we look at the activity, so you can see that where people are editing. So these edits were happening on Irish language Wikipedia. And you can see whether or not they added or took away characters. So if we take a look at, we can actually look at that article. So I think this might be an article that this editor created. It is. So they wrote about Patek Philippe. And if we go back to, we can then look at what the difference. So the article is unrated, don't worry about that. We can see what change was made. So you can expand it out. So you can see that he was adding in words. So he made a very small edit to that. He was just he was adding in Philippe after the name of, which technically he shouldn't have done. But you can see the change basically that was done to the article. So if your student is editing a particular article, here again, I'll look at another one. So this is going to be in Mandarin. So again, we can see, so strike through is something that's been removed, and green is content that's been added. So some of this is kind of technical stuff that's going on in citations and things like that. But if we scroll down a bit further. Okay, Cooperation Ireland is translated into German. So again, you can see like that's a reference being added. That's a citation being added to an article. Again, so this editor was adding citations to the article that they had written. So you can see that you can see which editor made that change. So that was Cooperation Ireland. So it's this editor here, Regina Prez, made that change. That means that they added, or it's possible that if there's a minus, it means that they took away content broadly. So this is the functionality of the dashboard. You can see this activity on Wiki as well. If they choose to upload any pictures or any media, you can also see that. You can also have a list of articles. So rather than seeing the activity list, this is a list of all the articles that the students have been working on during the module. So I mean, we'll obviously do a deeper dive on this during the boot camp, but this is kind of broadly the functionality, and this is a way of, as I said, kind of invigilating what students are doing. So it'll show you activity, not only published articles, but also the work that they're doing in their own user spaces as well. Okay, so actually editing Wikipedia, and this is when, can I move that? No, I cannot. This is where the control panel for hides my tabs. There we go. Thank you. So when I'm actually on Wikipedia, so this is the front page. I have the front page for each of our languages at the moment. So we have English. So this, as I said, this is the front page, as we call it. So you can see we have it in English, in Basque, in Irish, and in Frisian. You can see that the Basque one is slightly different. This is the new front page that has been developed, and it hasn't been adopted by all language Wikipedias. But you can see that fundamentally, if we say compare English, oh, damn you. This is where the control panel keeps turning up for me. I can't remember how to tab between tabs as opposed to windows. It'll go away in a minute. But you can see also, if you were to scroll down, you'll notice that it's broadly laid out in the same way. You'll get your amount of articles that exist. Okay, and if you scroll down the left-hand side, you'll see all the language versions of the article of the front page, basically. So you can also
control tab, Rebecca. Control and tab.
Nope, that doesn't want to work. Nope. You see, I'm in tab. There we go. So if we go to Wikipedia, you can see it's laid out in exactly the same way. Things exist in the same places. So you can see we have our login, which is the same as English. So fundamentally, they kind of operate in the same way, even though they are separate discrete sites. they, kind of things are signposted in the same way. If we log in, so because I logged into the dashboard, I was automatically logged in. But if I log out again and then log in, you can see I get my login window. That's my username and my password. If I log in here, this is what I was talking about with the global login. If I now refresh on the other sites, you can see it's starting to grab my username. It's noticed that I'm logged in. You can see here it's Smirky Beck as well, here in Irish. And even though I have never edited either Basque or Frisian, this is what I refer to as the global login. So once you've logged into one site, you're logged into all of them, okay? And you can edit any one of them, for good or for ill. And this also holds true for all the other Wikimedia projects, so Commons, Wikidata. Once you are logged into one of them, you're logged into all of them. You'll see that there's the one difference that I've noticed between Frisian and our other language Wikipedias is that we refer to the Sandbox. So once you're signed in and your username appears up the top, you have, and as new users, these will all be, most of these will be red for you because those pages do not exist. So when a page doesn't exist on Wikipedia, the link to it is red, okay? So your user page won't exist yet because you haven't created it. You don't have to create a user page. I would say for the project and being kind of leaders within the project, and if you're going to be doing editing demonstrations and things like that, it's probably a good idea to create one. There is no set format for a user page. You can add as much or as little information to it as you like. Because I both studied Wikipedia as part of my research, my doctoral research, but then now I work for a Wikimedia group, I have stated those affiliations. That's that conflict of interest piece, just so I'm not hiding any of my, I suppose, associations or motivations for being on Wikipedia. So I have identified myself by name, but you absolutely do not have to do that. You can say where you are. Equally, you don't have to. So if you kind of start clicking through and start looking at other people's user pages that I'll show you how to be able to do, you'll get a sense of some are one line, some never exist. And that's absolutely fine. As I said, there's no onus on you to create a user page. One of the benefits of it is that if you do have those associations, you're stating them up front. But also you might want to say what projects you're particularly interested in, what languages you like to edit in. These user boxes here are kind of, some of them are more serious, some of them are more fun. You can see you can identify yourself as where you're living. Again, I'll make this a bit bigger. But you can also see I have a user box that says that my home is overrun by cats. So much like the rest of the internet, there's some humor to a lot of these. You can also add a user box that states your ability in particular languages using the 1 to 4 grading in fluency. So if you're interested in stating that you are, fluent in Irish or Frisian, there will be user boxes that can help you find them if that's something that you're interested in adding to your user page. It's just what you want the rest of the community to know about you, basically. And the longer you're around, probably the more things that you will add. And also another thing that people add to their user page is when other Wikipedians thank them for stuff, and I can show you how to do this. You can give each other barn stars, which is kind of like giving each other gold stars, but you can also give each other gifts like cups of tea or boxes of cats and kittens and cookies, that sort of thing. So it's a way of editors acknowledging each other's work. It's part of kind of the thanking system. And how that's done generally, so you have your user page, and then you can see you have your talk page. And similarly, if we go across to Wikipedia here, just to show it in a different language, settings, so you can see I have, again, I'm still Smirky Beck. I have created, this is an automatic way of creating other user pages across all other interfaces, which say basically I'm primarily active on English language Wikipedia, so it redirects you. If you want to know more about me, go to my user page on English. But that can be set to go to any other language. So you could have this set to go to Wikipedia or Frisian or Basque. It doesn't default to English. You set that yourself. But you can see then we have, this is, I think Firefox does something weird where it starts pre-translating my interface into English. That should be play for talk. But you can see, there you go, play store. which is, kind of the user talk page. And similarly in English, I'll also have my talk page. So these are separate pages. So somebody can carry on a discussion with you, say on Basque. It doesn't get mirrored anywhere else. It only happens on that language Wikipedia. But if somebody wants to talk to you on a specific project, they go to your talk page and they post a message for you in a very kind of quaint, old-fashioned internet sort of way. Most of the people who talk to me on my talk page are bots. I get automatic postings about things that I might want to edit. You can also kind of get newsletters, particularly on some of the larger Wikipedias, kind of letting you know about content drives. So the one that I tend to get is the Women in Red. But what you'll find is once you make an editor to Wikipedia, in your language, you'll probably get a welcome from somebody. And that in smaller language Wikipedias, that probably won't be automated. It'll be a human will notice that you started editing Wikipedia and will thank you or welcome you or let you know, if you need any help, here I am. These are some tutorial pages, that sort of thing. There'll be kind of an introductory post. As I said, we also have Sandbox. So Sandbox is your user. It's in your user space, and it's a contained. It's not. The alternative to user space is main space, and main space is where all the articles live. That's stuff that's published on Wikipedia. Your user space is where you can start drafting something, start messing around with the platform, start editing, start just kind of getting used to how Wikipedia works. Now, not all language Wikipedias have sandboxes turned on by default, and this is something that we can explore a bit further in the bootcamp. But so you can see, I think, once again, let that go away. I don't think it's turned on Frisian. There isn't a default sandbox on Frisian for some reason, but it is quite easy to create a page in your user space, and you just prompt Wikipedia. So say if I wanted to create sandbox number 2, a user space, I just type that into the URL, whatever I want to call this user. So once I have user:/, and then whatever I want to call the page, hit return. It'll prompt you to create that page. So you can do this on Frisian. So even though you don't have Sandbox turned on, whatever nomenclature you would like to use. On Irish, it's Clár it's blackboard. So different languages will use a different word, the English one being Sandbox. But you just create this page and you just say, I'd like to start this. So I start my page.
Yeah, so what is that just to start? Is a sandbox whenever you want to start an article, is it?
If you want to start a draft.
Start draft, yeah.
So say if I wanted to create a page that's called, so I'm going to call it, Mary Swansea already exists, but say she didn't have an article and I wanted to start a draft on this particular person. So I'm going to create a page in my user space called Mary Swansea. So you can see it says user /Beck, which means it's in my user space /Mary Swansea. And whatever language Wikipedia you're in, you'll also have Usador, whatever it is, but your username will be the same across the languages. So I just say start this user page. Now, more than likely, it'll default you to what we refer to as Wiki Markup. Okay, so Wiki Markup is I suppose, the old-fashioned editor on Wikipedia. It's slightly HTML. What I'll do is I'll show you, if we actually go to Mary Swansea, be the easiest thing.
Just Rebecca, I have my Wikipedia opened here at the minute, and whenever I clicked into Sandbox, a window popped up saying switch to the visual editor or start editing. Yeah.
So I'll show you the difference between it now. Yeah, and yeah, you'll only ever get that pop-up once, which is why I can't simulate it as an established editor. Either going to your Sandbox or going to a Wikipedia article that you want to edit. If you hit edit, and you will, as new editors, you will only have edit. You won't have these 2 buttons, which is kind of confusing. But if you hit the edit button, as Fela was saying, you'll get this pop-up that says, would you like to continue in Visual Editor, or would you like to go to Wiki Markup? Visual Editor is this. It looks like the live article, and you can just click into it, basically. And you can just start typing. Yeah. So it's, it's what's referred to as a WYSIWYG or an overlay, which means that it looks like the live article. All of the functionality is done with these drop downs. So, we're in paragraph text at the moment, but this is a heading. If we want to add a citation, we have automatic buttons that we can use here. The older version of this, and you can flick between the two. I wouldn't do it too much if you're in, if you're editing. I wouldn't flick between the two because it tends to get a little bit confused. But this is what I was referring to as Wiki Markup. So it is a kind of pseudo HTML language, which basically all of the square brackets, curly brackets, all that sort of thing, they're powering the templates and the functionality that you're seeing in the live Wikipedia article. So everything in, say, in this section here, that's the info box. So that's that kind of box of information that floats on the right-hand side of the article. That's the template that's powering that. That's how it's done up in Wiki Markup. Similarly, the double square brackets, that's linking to another Wikipedia article. Okay, and this markup, this notation is common to all language Wikipedias. It works the same across languages. So it'll be the same functionality. If you ever find yourself staring at this, and this is not what you want to get back to Visual Editor, it's this pen icon in the top right-hand corner. So if you hover on it, it'll say Switch Editor. You just click the drop down and it's Visual Editing. When we're doing the bootcamp, I can show you how to click some buttons. So it defaults that you always go to Visual Editor if you find yourself kind of being bumped to Source Editor too often. But what this means is, similarly with your user page, your draft space, I'm looking at, this is Wiki Markup at the moment, this dialog box. I just flip over to Visual Editing. Now the page has nothing in it, obviously at the moment. But if I click into it, I can start typing. So if I say quick brown fox over the lazy dog. Oh, QWERTY sentence. So I've typed in, I've added some content to this page. I've started this draft. What other things do I want to do? I want to be able to add a citation. Okay, so you can see here we have our cite button. So I'm going to search for a citation for that. I'll just find something. You can see it has a Wikipedia article. This is where we're not able to find a good citation. It'll just be all crappy pages. But if I go to news, will we find something? What makes writing readable? We'll take that as our citation. So I'm going to grab that URL. Say I've added my piece of information from my source. I haven't done it this way. I haven't added information and decided to find a source to back it up. We should be doing it the other way around, obviously. But this is the website I'm taking it from. Say it's the Irish Times or the BBC or wherever I'm finding my information. I grab my URL. I head back to my page. I've added my bit of information, and now I'm going to add my source, my citation. Citations on Wikipedia always go after punctuation. So after a full stop, after a comma. Say if I'm taking a whole paragraph of text from one source, you don't have to add the citation after every sentence. You're repeating it. If a whole paragraph is coming from one source, you just add the citation at the end of the paragraph or the end of the clause. Once you stopped using that source, that's where you add it, and then you move on to your next. So we hit our cite button. Citation editors will work slightly differently, and I'll do more prep for camp just to see if there's any between. I know, so this is referred to as citoid. It doesn't operate exactly the same across all Wikipedias, and that's language support. We might find that we might want to do a little bit of language support in Frisian and Irish to ensure that these tools work well, but that's something that I'll work on in the background. But broadly, what we do is we add in our URL into our automatic, and then we hit generate. It won't work every time, but if you have a URL, an ISBN, so the ISBN on the back of a book, a DOI, so digital object identifier from a journal, you should be able to pop it into this this citation tool, which searches particular databases, and as you can see, automatically generates a citation. Now, this is not a great source, so the citation quality is going to be poor. When it comes to websites, it depends on how well the website is coded, whether it's grabbing the information correctly. But I say insert, so you can see my citation is there, and I can also then edit it. So if it comes up a little bit funny, I can tweak things like the last name, the first name, the source date. I don't know if we have a source date. You can see here we actually have authors, which ideally we should add those authors in. No, I don't think we have a source date. Oh, I think it's February, so a source state, we have our title, we have our URL. We can also say the language that it's coming from. So in this case, EN. This might be quite useful. Say if you happen to be using a non-Frisian or a non-Irish source on other language Wikipedias, you can flag that within the reference list. And then you just say apply changes. Oh, it doesn't like my date. Probably needs to be. It's happier with that. You can see it's added the date in afterwards. Citations, can get more or less complicated depending on the sources that students are using, and that's something that we can kind of do a more detailed briefing on in the future. But in general, it's a citation button. If we're in source editor, it works slightly differently. Again, why do you? There we go. If we're in Mary Swansea, and I'm in source editing. Similarly, what happens is you get to see. So this is the Wiki Markup that's powering a citation. So you can see anything that starts with the ref name and ends with /ref. That's a reference. So if I wanted to add a reference in source editor, we have our cite drop down here. And so this is the old-fashioned way of doing it. So we say cite web, I throw in the URL, and similarly, this also gives us some of the functionality to grab the information from it. Doesn't always work. Adding your access date. So you can see it's grabbed the information from the citation, and we just say insert. So this is the citation that I am not going to save, but this is the citation that I've just added. So functionality works across both of them. Okay, the other thing that is important to be able to do is add a link. So link to another Wikipedia article. So adding citations and adding links are the two kind of fundamental things that Wikipedians do. Okay, so if I want to link to the article on the fox, so beside cite, we have our link button, hit link. And what it does is in Visual Editor, it starts searching Wikipedia for articles that have the word fox in them. So first we get the animal, but then we get the broadcasting company. We get Fox News. See, we have Foxtel, we have Foxy Brown, a Trinidadian American rapper. So it starts searching for articles that have that particular word in it. What this means is that I can have, say, an acronym or something similar. What you link to in your text doesn't have to completely mirror the name of the article. So what I can do here is I could link to Fox. I could click Fox News here, and you can see rather than it linking to the article on the fox, the animal, it's linking to Fox News. So you can see this, and I can show you what that looks like in Source Editor as well. But it means that, say, if somebody's article is called something like John Byrne brackets computer scientist, because there's lots of different John Byrnes, it means that in your Wikipedia article, you don't have to have John Byrne open brackets computer scientist in your text. It doesn't have to mirror slavishly what the article is actually called. Okay, so once again, I mean, if I'm, if I want to add, so rather than paragraph text, I can put in a heading. So as you can see with, if we go back to the article, I'm going to discard those. So you can see how, particularly if we're thinking about biographical articles, we have kind of these sections. So you'll have headings.
Rebecca, I'm just wondering, could we maybe get a restart in this so we can maybe put some of that into practice? I think my brain's becoming saturated here, and I'd like to maybe just start in baby steps, if that's okay.
Yeah, so if everybody wants to go to their user space, and you can either add something to your user page. So if you add, again, similarly, you'll have your, that's automatically creating it for me. So if we go to our user page, you can either edit that and add some information about yourself to it, or if you want to go to your sandbox, as I noticed on Wikipedia, there isn't a sandbox. But similarly, if you go to your user space and say //sandbox, you can prompt the creation of one. We might look into getting the sandbox turned on on Frisian if you think that would be useful for the students to have it rather than do this workaround. It's obviously not very onerous. So how would everybody feel about it? Yeah. In the Basque, for the Basque contingent, you've probably done all this already, haven't you? Have you played with sandboxes?
Rebecca, I'm trying to look for the Irish language here in the Irish Wikipedia. I opened it in English. Should have went to the Irish, but how do we get into the? This is how basic. I can't
Is it there? Yeah. The simplest thing to do is
put the language before it.
Yeah. So yeah, wikipedia.org, and then you just add your language code to the start of it. Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Also, I think on the dashboard, did I have it? If you're interested in the other languages, you go back to the dashboard. Did they link? No, they don't. But you can see, so EU is for Basque, GA is for Irish, and FY, the right Frisian. The Frisian we care about. How are people getting on with that?